Good evening, dear friend. Come now, settle yourself gently into comfort and let the concerns of the day drift away like clouds moving slowly across a twilight sky. Tonight, I want to tell you a story about power and resistance, about one man whose ambition reshaped Europe and about how the great powers of the continent spent nearly 2 decades trying to contain him. This is not a story of individual battles or military heroics, but rather of grand strategy, of shifting alliances, of how nations form coalitions and how those coalitions succeed or fail. As you rest here in the peaceful darkness, breathing slowly and steadily, let yourself drift back through time with me, back to the 1790s, when revolutionary France was challenging the old order of Europe and when a young artillery officer named Napoleon Bonaparte was beginning his remarkable rise to power. The France you enter in 1793 is a nation transformed and transforming itself through revolution. The old monarchy has been swept away, King Louis XVI has been executed, and the revolutionary government in Paris is attempting to create an entirely new political order based on principles of liberty, equality, and popular sovereignty. But this revolution has alarmed the monarchies of Europe, who see in France's transformation a dangerous example that might inspire their own subjects to rebellion, and a threat to the established order that has governed European international relations for generations. The first coalition against revolutionary France forms gradually during 1792 and 1793, bringing together Austria, Prussia, Great Britain, Spain, and several smaller German and Italian states in a shared determination to contain French revolutionary expansion and, if possible, to restore the French monarchy. This coalition is not a unified alliance with coordinated strategy but rather a loose association of powers with different interests and different levels of commitment to the anti-French cause. Austria and Prussia, the great German powers, are primarily concerned with preventing revolutionary ideas from spreading into their territories and with maintaining their influence in the German states. Britain is motivated by traditional concern about French power and by desire to protect its commercial and colonial interests. Spain, though ruled by a Bourbon dynasty related to the deposed French royal family, has its own complex calculations about security and advantage. As you breathe slowly and let yourself relax more deeply, imagine the situation facing revolutionary France in 1793. The country is surrounded by hostile powers whose armies are moving toward French borders. Internally, France is experiencing civil war in regions like the Vendée where conservative peasants are rising against the revolutionary government. The revolutionary government in Paris responds to these multiple threats with emergency measures, creating the Committee of Public Safety to coordinate the war effort and instituting mass conscription to create armies far larger than those fielded by the coalition powers. This levée en masse, the mobilization of the entire nation for war, represents a new kind of warfare that will prove remarkably effective. The revolutionary armies that France sends forth to meet the coalition forces are different from traditional 18th century armies in several important ways. They are motivated by ideology as well as by discipline, seeing themselves as defenders of the revolution and of the new France that the revolution is creating. They are larger than their opponents, benefiting from mass conscription that gives France access to military manpower on a scale that the coalition monarchies, still relying on smaller professional armies, cannot match. and they are led by officers promoted for ability rather than for birth, creating opportunities for talented commanders from modest backgrounds to rise to high rank. One such officer is Napoleon Bonaparte, a Corsican artillery officer who comes to prominence in December 1793 when he devises the plan that leads to the recapture of the port city of Toulon from royalist rebels and British forces. Napoleon's performance at Toulon brings him to the attention of the revolutionary government, earning him promotion to brigadier general at the age of 24. Over the next several years, he will rise with remarkable speed through the ranks of the French military, demonstrating not only tactical brilliance but also political acumen and an ability to inspire soldiers and to win the confidence of civilian authorities. By 1796, the First Coalition is already weakening. Prussia, having gained territory in Poland through the partitions and having concluded that fighting France is expensive and unprofitable, withdraws from the war. Spain also makes peace with France. But Austria and Britain continue the struggle, with Austria fighting to maintain its position in Italy and the Low Countries, and Britain providing financial support to continental allies while using its naval power to blockade French ports and to attack French colonial possessions. It is in the Italian campaign of 1796 and 1797 that Napoleon, now commanding the French army of Italy, achieves his first great successes and begins to reshape European geopolitics. As you rest quietly, breathing slowly and peacefully, imagine Napoleon, 26 years old, taking command of an army that is poorly supplied and demoralized, and transforming it through his energy and his strategic vision into an instrument that will conquer northern Italy and force Austria to make peace. Napoleon's Italian campaign is not won through a single decisive battle but through a series of operations that demonstrate his understanding of how to use speed and concentration of force to defeat larger enemy armies that are divided and poorly coordinated. The campaign in Italy has strategic consequences beyond the military victories themselves. Napoleon conquers the wealthy northern Italian territories that Austria has long dominated, establishing French control over a region whose resources can support French military operations. He reorganizes Italian territories into French satellite republics, spreading revolutionary political principles and creating a zone of French influence. And he negotiates the Treaty of Campo Formio with Austria in October 1797, dictating terms that reflect France's strong negotiating position. Austria recognizes French control of Belgium and accepts French-dominated republics in northern Italy, receiving in compensation the territory of Venice, which Napoleon cynically hands over despite Venice's centuries of independence. The Treaty of Campo Formio effectively ends the First Coalition, though Britain continues to fight alone. The treaty also demonstrates Napoleon's growing political influence, as he negotiates directly with Austria without close supervision from the French government in Paris. He is becoming not merely a successful general but a political force, a figure whose victories make him popular with the French public and whose ambitions are beginning to extend beyond purely military achievements. The First Coalition's failure to contain revolutionary France or to restore the monarchy demonstrates several patterns that will recur throughout the Napoleonic Wars. Coalition members have different interests and different priorities, making coordination difficult and creating opportunities for France to exploit divisions among its enemies. The coalition powers are using traditional 18th century military methods and limited armies against a France that has mobilized its entire nation for war, giving France numerical advantages and a level of commitment that its enemies cannot match. And the French have found in Napoleon a commander of exceptional ability who can translate military resources into strategic gains through speed, concentration of force, and skillful exploitation of enemy mistakes. As you breathe slowly and sink deeper into peaceful rest, you can understand how the stage is being set for the longer struggle that will follow. Revolutionary France has defeated the First Coalition and has expanded its territory and influence. Napoleon has emerged as France's most successful commander and has demonstrated abilities that mark him as exceptional. But the fundamental tensions between France and the other European powers have not been resolved. Britain remains at war, committed to containing French power and maintaining the balance of power in Europe. Austria, though defeated, has not accepted permanent French domination of Italy and will seek opportunities to reverse its losses. And new powers, particularly Russia, are beginning to take interest in Western European affairs and to consider what role they might play in containing France. The pattern of coalitions forming against France, fighting with varying degrees of success, and eventually dissolving when members conclude that continuing the war is too costly or when France defeats them militarily, will repeat itself multiple times over the next 2 decades. Each coalition will face the same basic challenge: how to coordinate the efforts of multiple powers with different interests against a France that is unified under increasingly centralized leadership and that can bring overwhelming force to bear at decisive points. The story of the Napoleonic Wars is in many ways the story of how European powers gradually learn to work together effectively enough to counter French dominance, a learning process that will take many years and multiple failed attempts before succeeding. In the spring of 1798, as you rest comfortably and breathe slowly, France finds itself in an unusual strategic position. The First Coalition has been defeated, the continent is at peace except for the ongoing war with Britain, and the French government faces the question of what to do with its victorious armies and ambitious generals, particularly Napoleon, whose successes in Italy have made him popular but also somewhat dangerous to civilian authority. The solution arrived at is to send Napoleon on an expedition to Egypt, a campaign that will have as its official goals striking at British interests in the Eastern Mediterranean and ultimately threatening British India, but that will also serve the purpose of keeping Napoleon occupied far from Paris. The Egyptian expedition of 1798 and 1799 is a curious episode in the larger story of the Napoleonic Wars, combining genuine strategic calculation with elements of romantic adventure and scholarly exploration. Napoleon sails from Toulon in May 1798 with a substantial army and a flotilla of ships, but also with a commission of scientists, scholars, and artists who will study Egyptian history, culture, and monuments. The expedition captures Malta on the way to Egypt, then successfully invades Egypt itself, defeating the Mamluk forces that nominally govern the country under Ottoman suzerainty. But British Admiral Horatio Nelson destroys the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile in August 1798, stranding Napoleon and his army in Egypt and demonstrating once again British naval superiority. The destruction of the French fleet at Abuka Bay has strategic consequences that extend far beyond the immediate military defeat. It leaves the French army in Egypt isolated, unable to be reinforced or supplied from France, and vulnerable to Ottoman and British operations designed to drive the French out. More importantly, it encourages the formation of a second coalition against France, as European powers see opportunity in French vulnerability and in Britain's continued resistance. Russia, which had not participated in the first coalition, now enters the struggle under Tsar Paul I, motivated by concern about French expansion in the Mediterranean and by traditional Russian interest in the fate of the Ottoman Empire. Austria, still smarting from its losses in Italy and concerned about renewed French expansion, rejoins the war. The Ottoman Empire, responding to the French invasion of its Egyptian territory, also enters the coalition. As you breathe slowly and let yourself relax more deeply, imagine how the strategic situation has shifted. France now faces war on multiple fronts: in Italy, where Austrian and Russian forces are attempting to drive out the French; in Switzerland, where coalition forces are trying to break French control of this strategically important territory; in Germany, where Austria is again mobilizing; and in Egypt, where the French expeditionary force is increasingly isolated. The French government, now controlled by the Directory, a five-man executive that has proven corrupt and ineffective, struggles to coordinate responses to these multiple threats. The army in Egypt, though conducting successful local operations, cannot affect the broader strategic situation and is essentially trapped. Napoleon's absence from the main theater of war during much of the Second Coalition proves consequential. In his absence, French forces in Italy and Switzerland suffer defeats at the hands of Austrian and Russian armies commanded by skilled generals, including the legendary Russian Marshal Alexander Suvorov. By summer of 1799, much of Napoleon's Italian conquests have been lost, and France's strategic position has deteriorated significantly. The Second Coalition appears to be succeeding where the First Coalition failed, rolling back French expansion and potentially threatening France itself. But the Second Coalition, like the First, suffers from coordination problems and conflicting interests among its members. Austria and Russia, though allied against France, have different priorities and sometimes work at cross purposes. Russian forces operating far from home in Switzerland and Italy face serious logistical challenges. Britain, providing financial subsidies to continental allies and maintaining naval blockades, cannot directly influence the land campaigns where the main fighting occurs. And France, despite its setbacks, retains substantial military resources and the advantage of interior lines, allowing it to shift forces between threatened sectors more easily than the coalition powers can coordinate their operations. In August 1799, Napoleon abandons his army in Egypt and returns to France, making the dangerous sea voyage despite British naval dominance and arriving in Paris in October. His return comes at a moment when the French government is in crisis, unable to manage the war effectively or to address France's internal problems. Within weeks of his return, Napoleon participates in the coup of Brumaire, overthrowing the Directory and establishing a new government called the Consulate, with Napoleon as first consul holding most executive power. This political transformation is at least as important as any military victory, as it centralizes French political authority in Napoleon's hands and creates a system that will prove far more effective at mobilizing French resources and coordinating military strategy than the fractious Directory had been. As you rest quietly in the peaceful darkness, breathing slowly and deeply, you can appreciate how Napoleon's return and his seizure of power transform France's strategic position. The new consulate government acts with energy and decisiveness that the Directory lacked. Napoleon organizes new armies, appoints capable commanders, and plans operations designed to reverse French defeats and to drive the coalition forces back. In the spring of 1800, he leads an army across the Alps into Italy, replicating in some ways his earlier Italian campaigns, but now doing so as France's political leader as well as its military commander. The campaign of 1800 culminates in French victories that restore France's position in Italy and that convince Austria to seek peace. The Treaty of Luneville, signed in February 1801, re-established French dominance in Italy and in the German territories west of the Rhine. Austria is again forced to recognize French satellite republics and French territorial gains. Russia, disappointed with its Austrian ally and disillusioned with the coalition, has already withdrawn from the war. Britain, though still maintaining its naval blockade and continuing to fight at sea and in colonial theaters, again finds itself fighting alone without continental allies. The Second Coalition thus ends much as the First did, with France victorious and with the coalition dissolved by members' diverging interests and by French military success. But the Second Coalition has been more serious than the First in some ways, bringing together more powers including Russia for the first time, and coming closer to threatening France itself. Napoleon has emerged from the crisis not only as France's leading general but as its political ruler, consolidating in his own person both military command and civilian authority to a degree unprecedented in revolutionary France. This concentration of power will shape all subsequent French strategy and will make the conflict increasingly personal, a struggle not just between France and its neighbors but between Napoleon and the European powers. The period between the end of the Second Coalition and the formation of the Third will see a brief respite in continental warfare, though Britain and France remain at war at sea and in colonial territories. This breathing space allows Napoleon to consolidate his power within France, to reform French administration and law including the creation of the Napoleonic Code, and to begin transforming the French Republic into a more openly authoritarian regime that will eventually become an empire with Napoleon as emperor. The brief Peace of Amiens with Britain in 1802 and 1803 offers an illusory prospect of general peace, but the fundamental conflicts between France and the European powers remain unresolved. Napoleon's ambitions and France's dominant position, created through revolutionary mobilization and military success, continue to challenge the traditional balance of power in Europe, making renewed conflict almost inevitable. In December 1804, as you breathe slowly and rest comfortably, Napoleon crowns himself Emperor of the French in a magnificent ceremony at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, symbolically taking the crown from the Pope's hands and placing it on his own head to emphasize that his authority comes from his own achievements rather than from divine sanction or from any external source. This coronation transforms the French Republic into the French Empire and transforms Napoleon from First Consul into Emperor Napoleon I, formalizing the concentration of power that has been developing since the coup of Brumaire and making explicit what had been implicit for several years, that France is no longer a revolutionary republic but a monarchical empire, albeit one founded on merit and military success rather than on inherited right. The transformation of France into an empire and of Napoleon into an emperor has important implications for European international relations. The old monarchies of Europe have been dealing with revolutionary France as an ideological threat, a dangerous experiment in popular government that might inspire their own subjects to rebellion. But an imperial France led by an emperor, even one who rose from relatively modest origins through military achievement, is more comprehensible in traditional terms. Napoleon is creating a new dynasty, marrying into established royal families, granting titles to his supporters, organizing his empire along lines that the old monarchies can understand even as they oppose his power. The transformation does not make France less threatening to the European balance of power, but it does change the nature of the threat from ideological challenge to more traditional great power rivalry. Britain has been at war with France almost continuously since 1793, with only the brief interlude of the Peace of Amiens interrupting the conflict. By 1805, Britain finds itself again organizing a coalition against France, the Third Coalition, bringing together Austria, Russia, Sweden, and Naples in a renewed effort to contain French power. The trigger for renewed war has been Napoleon's continued expansion in Italy and Germany, his assumption of the Italian crown in addition to his French imperial title, and his reorganization of German territories in ways that threaten Austrian influence and alarm Russia. The strategic situation facing the Third Coalition is in some ways more challenging than that faced by previous coalitions. Napoleon is now not merely a successful general but the absolute ruler of France, able to coordinate military strategy and political policy without the confusion and divided authority that characterized earlier French governments. France has been at peace on the continent for several years, allowing Napoleon to prepare his forces and to position them advantageously for renewed conflict. And Napoleon's reorganization of Italian and German territories has created a constellation of satellite states and allied powers that expand effective French military resources beyond France itself. As you breathe slowly and let yourself relax more deeply, imagine the grand strategy that the Third Coalition attempts to implement. The plan involves coordinated advances by Austrian and Russian armies into French-controlled territories in southern Germany and Italy, converging to overwhelm French forces through sheer numbers and coordination. Britain will provide financial subsidies to support Allied operations and will use its naval power to threaten French possessions and to interdict French maritime commerce. Sweden will threaten French positions in northern Germany. The coalition hopes that this multi-front pressure will overwhelm even Napoleon's considerable abilities and will force France to accept peace on terms that restore the European balance of power. But Napoleon's response to the Third Coalition demonstrates his mastery of what later military theorists will call operational art, the level of military planning between grand strategy and battlefield tactics. He recognizes that the coalition's strength lies in numbers and coordination, so he acts with speed to prevent that coordination from being achieved. The Grande Army, the great army that Napoleon has organized and trained during the years of peace, moves from the English Channel where it had been assembled for a planned invasion of Britain, and marches rapidly eastward across the Rhine into Germany. This movement is executed with remarkable speed and precision, the product of careful planning and of an efficient administrative system that can move and supply large armies over substantial distances. The campaign of 1805 in Germany proceeds with stunning speed. Napoleon positions his forces between the separated Austrian and Russian armies, defeats the Austrians before the Russians can arrive to support them, and forces an entire Austrian army to surrender. Austria sues for peace. But Russia continues to fight, and Napoleon pursues the Russian army eastward, eventually bringing it to battle in December 1805. The campaign demonstrates Napoleon's ability not only to defeat enemies in battle but to plan and execute operations at the strategic level, moving large forces over hundreds of miles, maintaining supply lines, and coordinating multiple corps to achieve decisive results. The Peace of Pressburg with Austria, signed at the end of 1805, confirms France's dominant position in Germany and Italy. Austria loses significant territories and accepts French reorganization of German states. The Holy Roman Empire, that ancient institution that has provided at least nominal framework for German political organization for centuries, is effectively finished, though it will not be formally dissolved until the following year. Napoleon creates the Confederation of the Rhine, a grouping of German states under French protection and effectively under French control, extending French power deep into Central Europe and creating a buffer zone between France and Austria and Prussia. As you rest quietly in the peaceful darkness, breathing slowly and deeply, you can sense how the Third Coalition has ended even more decisively than the first two. Austria has been defeated twice now in a decade and has suffered serious territorial losses. Russia has been pushed back to its own frontiers. Britain remains undefeated at sea but has again lost its continental allies and can do little to directly affect events on the continent. Napoleon's empire stands at the height of its power in early 1806, dominating Western and Central Europe to a degree not seen since the age of Charlemagne 1,000 years earlier. But this very dominance creates the conditions for renewed coalition formation. The European powers cannot accept permanent French hegemony, and Napoleon's continued expansion alarms even powers that have not yet been directly threatened. Prussia, which has remained neutral through the Third Coalition, now finds French power on its borders intolerable and begins preparing for war. Russia, though defeated in the field, has not been invaded or forced to accept humiliating peace terms, and maintains both the capability and the determination to continue resisting French dominance. Britain's commitment to maintaining the balance of power and to preventing any single power from dominating the continent remains unshaken despite the failure of successive coalitions. The period from late 1805 through 1806 sees Napoleon at perhaps the peak of his power and prestige. He has defeated 3 coalitions in little more than a decade, has expanded French territory and influence across Western and Central Europe, has created satellite kingdoms ruled by members of his family, and has established himself as the dominant figure in European politics. His military reputation is unmatched, his political control of France is absolute, and his ambitions appear unlimited. But the seeds of future difficulties are already being sown. Each defeated power retains grievances and desires for revenge. The territories under French control or influence require military garrisons and administrative oversight, straining French resources. And the very success of French expansion motivates continued resistance from powers that cannot accept the new order that Napoleon is creating. The Fourth Coalition will form in 1806 as Prussia, alarmed by French dominance in Germany and encouraged by Russia, enters the war. This coalition will be defeated even more rapidly than the Third, with Prussia suffering catastrophic defeats within weeks of the war's beginning and being forced to accept harsh peace terms. Napoleon will then turn his attention to Russia, fighting a long and costly campaign in Poland and East Prussia that will demonstrate both his abilities and his limitations. The pattern of coalition formation, French victory, and renewed coalition formation will continue, but each iteration will be more difficult for France as the strain of continuous warfare accumulates and as Napoleon's enemies learn from their failures and begin to develop more effective strategies for resisting French power. As you breathe slowly and rest comfortably in the peaceful quiet, let me tell you about the period from 1806 through 1807, when Napoleon extended French dominance to its greatest geographical extent and when the pattern of European resistance to French power became increasingly clear even as that resistance continued to fail militarily. Prussia's entry into the war in autumn 1806, forming the Fourth Coalition together with Russia, Britain, Saxony, and Sweden, represents another attempt to contain French expansion through coordinated military pressure from multiple powers. Prussia in 1806 is a curious power, possessing a formidable military reputation based on the achievements of Frederick the Great in the mid-18th century but having not fought a major war for a decade while other European powers gained experience fighting revolutionary and Napoleonic France. The Prussian military establishment prides itself on discipline and training, on a long tradition of military excellence, and on the efficiency of its administration and logistics. But the Prussian army is in many ways still fighting according to the methods of Frederick the Great, slow and methodical, while Napoleon's way of war emphasizes speed, concentration of force, and rapid exploitation of enemy mistakes. The campaign that destroys Prussian military power unfolds with remarkable speed in October 1806. Napoleon's Grande Army moves rapidly through Saxony into Prussia, using multiple corps that march separately but that can concentrate rapidly when battle is necessary. Within 2 weeks of crossing into Prussian territory, Napoleon defeats the main Prussian armies, captures Berlin, and effectively eliminates Prussia as a military factor in the war. The speed and completeness of the Prussian collapse shocks European opinion and demonstrates once again Napoleon's remarkable ability to wage war at the operational level, moving large forces quickly and decisively to achieve strategic objectives. But defeating Prussia does not end the war, because Russia continues to fight, and Russian armies operating in Poland and East Prussia prove more difficult to defeat than the Prussians had been. The campaign of 1806 through 1807 against Russia demonstrates some of the limitations of French power even at its height. Russian armies can retreat into vast spaces that strain French logistics and communications. Russian winter conditions are severe, making operations difficult and expensive. Russian society, more autocratic and less developed than Western European societies, is harder to influence through political means or to demoralize through military defeats. and Russian determination to resist French domination is strong, motivated by traditional great power pride and by orthodox religious hostility to what many Russians see as godless revolutionary principles emanating from France. As you breathe slowly and let yourself relax more deeply, imagine the long winter and spring of 1806 through 1807, with French and Russian armies facing each other in the cold and mud of Poland, fighting battles that are costly but indecisive, with neither side able to achieve the kind of decisive victory that Napoleon has become accustomed to winning. This is a different kind of warfare from the rapid campaigns in Germany and Italy, more attritional and grinding, testing French resources and organization rather than simply French battlefield prowess. Eventually, in June 1807, Napoleon does achieve a significant victory over Russian forces, and Tsar Alexander I agrees to meet Napoleon to negotiate peace. The meeting between the two emperors takes place on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River, equally distant from both French and Russian positions, a theatrical setting for a diplomatic encounter that will reshape the European order. The Treaty of Tilsit that emerges from these negotiations is extraordinary in its scope and implications. Russia agrees to recognize French dominance in Western and Central Europe and to join the continental system, Napoleon's economic warfare policy against Britain. France agrees to recognize Russian dominance in Eastern Europe and to support Russian ambitions regarding the Ottoman Empire and Sweden. The Treaty of Tilsit creates a division of Europe between French and Russian spheres of influence, effectively creating a French-Russian condominium over the continent. Prussia is reduced to half its former size, losing territories that are reorganized into French satellite states including the Grand Duchy of Warsaw. Austria, though not directly involved in the Fourth Coalition, is further isolated. Britain alone remains openly at war with France, unable to influence continental affairs directly but maintaining its naval dominance and its commitment to eventual restoration of the European balance of power. The period from mid-1807 through 1809 represents the height of Napoleon's continental dominance. French military power is unchallenged on land. The Grande Army has defeated every opponent it has faced. French territory extends from the Spanish border to the borders of Russia, and French influence extends even further through satellite states, allied powers, and neutral countries that must accommodate French wishes. Napoleon's family members rule as kings in Spain, Holland, Westphalia, and Naples. The Confederation of the Rhine groups German states under French protection. Poland has been partially restored in the form of the Grand Duchy of Warsaw. Italy is divided between territories directly controlled by France and satellite kingdoms. As you rest quietly in the peaceful darkness, breathing slowly and deeply, you can appreciate both the extent of Napoleon's achievement and the challenges it creates. Managing this vast empire requires not just military victories but effective administration, economic organization, and diplomatic skill. French garrisons must be maintained across Europe to ensure security and to enforce French policy. Local populations must be governed, requiring French administrators or collaborators who can implement French systems while managing local resistance. Economic resources must be extracted from subject territories to support French military operations and to maintain French dominance. And the continental system, designed to exclude British goods from European markets and to wage economic war against Britain, must be enforced despite the economic hardships it creates for continental populations accustomed to trading with Britain. The continental system deserves particular attention as you breathe slowly and peacefully, because it represents Napoleon's answer to the fundamental problem that has frustrated him throughout his rise to power: his inability to defeat Britain. French military dominance on land has not translated into ability to project power across the English Channel, and British naval dominance has prevented any serious French attempt to invade Britain. Napoleon's solution is economic warfare, attempting to strangle British commerce by closing European markets to British goods, thereby damaging British economy and forcing Britain to make peace on French terms. But the continental system creates significant problems for Napoleon's European empire. Continental populations suffer from lack of access to British manufactured goods and from loss of traditional trading patterns. Smuggling becomes widespread as merchants and consumers seek to evade the blockade. Enforcement requires constant vigilance and military presence. And some powers, even those nominally allied with France, find the system's economic costs too high and begin to look for ways to evade its requirements. Russia, despite the Treaty of Tilsit, finds that participating in the continental system damages Russian trade interests, particularly the export of Russian grain and timber to Britain, creating tensions in the Franco-Russian relationship that will eventually lead to renewed war. Austria, having been defeated twice and having lost significant territory and influence, is not content with the position France has relegated it to. Austrian statesmen and military leaders study Napoleon's methods, reform their own military institutions, and wait for opportunities to challenge French dominance. In 1809, believing that Napoleon is preoccupied with Spain, where a rebellion against French rule has created serious difficulties, Austria launches another war, the War of the Fifth Coalition, hoping to recover lost territories and influence in Germany and Italy. The Fifth Coalition proves short-lived, as Napoleon once again demonstrates his ability to concentrate French power and to defeat his enemies. But the Austrian campaign of 1809 is more difficult than earlier Austrian campaigns, requiring hard fighting and resulting in costly battles. Austria is again defeated and forced to make peace, losing additional territory and having to pay a large indemnity. But the fact that Austria was willing to try again, despite two previous defeats, demonstrates that Napoleon has not solved the fundamental problem of creating a stable European order that defeated powers will accept. Each military victory imposes peace terms that the defeated power accepts because it has no choice, but those peace terms breed resentment and desire for revenge, ensuring that as soon as circumstances seem favorable, defeated powers will try again to challenge French dominance. By 1810, Napoleon controls or influences virtually all of continental Europe. Only Britain remains openly at war, and Russia, though nominally allied with France, is increasingly restive under the constraints of the alliance. Napoleon has achieved remarkable military and political success, creating an empire on a scale that Europe has not seen for centuries. But maintaining this empire is proving more difficult than creating it, and the seeds of future difficulties are already sprouting. As you rest comfortably and breathe slowly, Let me tell you about a development that would prove crucial in undermining Napoleon's continental dominance, the Spanish uprising and the long guerrilla war that followed. In 1808, Napoleon, having concluded that Spain's Bourbon monarchy is unreliable and that Spain's resources should be more directly controlled by France, engineers a dynastic change, forcing the Spanish king to abdicate and placing Napoleon's brother Joseph on the Spanish throne. This high-handed manipulation of Spanish sovereignty, done without consultation with the Spanish people and in violation of Spain's traditions and pride, sparks a popular uprising that transforms what Napoleon expected to be a simple political reorganization into a long and costly war. The Spanish resistance to French occupation takes forms quite different from the conventional warfare that Napoleon has faced and mastered in his campaigns against Austrian, Prussian, and Russian armies. Spanish regular forces are defeated relatively easily when they face French armies in conventional battles. But the Spanish population does not accept defeat, does not acknowledge Joseph Bonaparte as legitimate king, and does not submit to French authority. Instead, resistance continues through guerrilla warfare, through irregular forces that attack French communications and supply lines, through popular uprising in cities and towns, through a sustained campaign of harassment that makes French occupation costly and frustrating. The term guerrilla, meaning little war in Spanish, comes from this conflict and describes a form of warfare where irregular forces use mobility, local knowledge, and popular support to attack a more powerful conventional military force while avoiding decisive battles where their weakness in numbers and equipment would be exposed. Spanish guerrillas attack isolated French garrisons, ambush French patrols, cut French supply lines, and disappear into the countryside or into urban neighborhoods before French forces can respond effectively. French troops must be dispersed across Spain to maintain control of territory, making those forces vulnerable to guerrilla attack. But when French forces concentrate to hunt guerrillas, the guerrillas simply melt away and the French cannot bring them to battle. As you breathe slowly and let yourself relax more deeply, imagine the frustration of French commanders and soldiers in Spain, accustomed to campaigns where decisive battles determine outcomes and where military victory leads to political settlement, now facing a conflict where military success does not translate into political control, where defeating Spanish armies does not end Spanish resistance, where occupying major cities does not bring security to the countryside. The Spanish War becomes what Napoleon will later call his Spanish ulcer, a running sore that constantly drains French military resources without offering hope of decisive resolution. Britain, which has been unable to challenge French power directly on the continent, sees opportunity in Spain to open a front where British military forces can operate effectively with Spanish support. British General Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington, lands in Portugal with a small British army and begins a campaign that, in cooperation with Spanish and Portuguese forces and with support from Spanish guerrillas, will gradually push the French back in the Iberian Peninsula. This campaign will continue for years, tying down hundreds of thousands of French troops who might otherwise be available for use in Central Europe, degrading the quality of French forces as experienced troops are ground down in the Spanish War, and demonstrating that French military power has limits and that sustained popular resistance can frustrate even Napoleon's strategic designs. The Spanish War has significance beyond its direct military effects. It demonstrates that popular nationalism can be a force powerful enough to resist even the mighty French Empire, that peoples who are determined to maintain their independence and identity can make foreign occupation intolerable even when they cannot defeat occupying forces in conventional battles. This lesson is not lost on other European peoples, particularly Germans and Italians who live under French domination or French influence. If Spanish people can resist French power, might not other peoples resist as well? The Spanish example inspires patriotic movements elsewhere and contributes to a gradual shift in how European resistance to Napoleon is organized and motivated. Austria's decision to go to war again in 1809, forming the Fifth Coalition, is influenced partly by events in Spain. Austrian leaders believe that Napoleon's difficulties in Spain have weakened French power and have created an opportunity for Austria to challenge French dominance in Central Europe. Though the Fifth Coalition is defeated and Austria is again forced to make peace, the calculation itself demonstrates how Spain is affecting the overall strategic situation. Napoleon can still defeat conventional armies in Central Europe, but he cannot be everywhere at once, and his difficulties in Spain limit his freedom of action elsewhere. As you rest quietly in the peaceful darkness, breathing slowly and deeply, you can appreciate how the nature of resistance to French power is evolving. The early coalitions relied on conventional military force, attempting to defeat French armies in battle and to recover territories through military success. These attempts failed repeatedly because Napoleon's military genius and France's superior military organization gave France decisive advantages in conventional warfare. But Spain demonstrates that unconventional resistance, popular uprising supported by regular forces and by foreign assistance, can achieve what conventional military operations could not, making French occupation costly and ultimately unsustainable. The period from 1808 through 1812 sees Napoleon increasingly strained by the demands of maintaining his empire. Troops must be maintained in Spain to fight the endless guerrilla war and to oppose British and Spanish forces in the peninsula. Garrisons must be maintained across Europe to control subject populations and to enforce French policies including the continental system. The continental system itself is creating economic hardship and resentment in territories required to comply with it, including in France itself where some commercial interests are damaged by exclusion from British markets. And Russia, France's nominal ally since Tilsit, is increasingly unhappy with the alliance, particularly with the economic costs of the continental system and with Napoleon's continued expansion in Europe, including into areas that Russia considers its sphere of influence. Napoleon's response to these accumulating strains is characteristically bold but ultimately counterproductive. Rather than consolidating his position and seeking to stabilize his empire, he continues to expand, annexing additional territories directly into France, creating new satellite kingdoms, interfering in the internal affairs of nominally independent allies. The annexation of Holland in 1810, after his brother Louis who ruled there proves insufficiently compliant with French demands, demonstrates Napoleon's unwillingness to tolerate any independence even from family members ruling satellite states. The continued expansion of the continental system and the aggressive enforcement of its requirements alienate allies and create resentment in territories that must bear its economic costs. The relationship with Russia deteriorates steadily through 1810 and 1811 as Russia, finding the economic costs of the continental system intolerable, begins to relax enforcement and to allow trade with Britain through neutral intermediaries. Napoleon, viewing any breach in the continental system as unacceptable because it undermines the economic warfare on which he has staked France's hope of forcing Britain to make peace, sees Russian violations as betrayal of the Tilsit alliance. Other issues also divide France and Russia, including Napoleon's creation of the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, which Russia sees as potentially threatening to Russian interests in Poland, and disagreements about spheres of influence in the Balkans, where both powers have interests regarding the weakening Ottoman Empire. By early 1812, war between France and Russia appears increasingly inevitable. Napoleon begins assembling an enormous army, drawing on French resources and on those of satellite states and reluctant allies, creating a force of several 100,000 men that will be the largest army Europe has seen. He plans a campaign that will invade Russia, defeat Russian forces, and force Tsar Alexander I to return to alliance with France and to enforce the continental system. This campaign will prove to be a turning point in the Napoleonic Wars, demonstrating the limits of French power and beginning the process by which Napoleon's empire will unravel. In June 1812, as you breathe slowly and rest comfortably, Napoleon leads his Grande Army across the Niemen River into Russia, beginning the campaign that will mark the beginning of the end of his European dominance. The army he commands is the largest force ever assembled under his command, numbering over 600,000 men drawn from France and from the satellite states and allied kingdoms that make up Napoleon's empire. This massive force includes French troops but also Germans, Italians, Poles, Dutch, and contingents from numerous other territories under Napoleon's control or influence. It is a truly European army, though one serving French strategic interests and commanded by French leadership. The strategy Napoleon plans for the Russian campaign follows patterns that have worked successfully in his previous campaigns. He intends to advance rapidly into Russia, force Russian armies to give battle, defeat them decisively, occupy Moscow, and dictate peace terms from Russia's ancient capital. The campaign should be swift, decided within a few months, allowing the Grande Army to return before the Russian winter makes operations impossible. Napoleon has studied previous campaigns in Russia, including Charles XII of Sweden's disastrous invasion a century earlier, and believes he has learned from those failures and has made adequate preparations for the logistical challenges that operations in Russia will present. But the Russian campaign unfolds very differently from Napoleon's plans. The Russian armies, rather than standing and fighting where Napoleon can bring his superior numbers and tactical skill to bear, retreat before the French advance, drawing Napoleon deeper into Russia while avoiding the kind of decisive battle that might allow him to achieve victory. This strategy is partly deliberate and partly forced by circumstances. Russian commanders recognize that Napoleon's army is larger and that attempting to fight him near the border would likely result in defeat. But Russian retreat also reflects political realities, as Tsar Alexander faces pressure from Russian nobility and military officers who demand that Russian armies fight to defend Russian soil rather than abandoning territory without resistance. As you breathe slowly and let yourself relax more deeply, Imagine the Grande Army advancing across the vast spaces of western Russia through the summer of 1812, marching hundreds of miles, fighting occasional battles against Russian rearguards, but never managing to pin down the main Russian armies for the decisive battle that Napoleon seeks. The army begins to suffer from the moment it crosses the Russian frontier. Supply lines stretching back hundreds of miles cannot adequately provision such a large force. Horses die from lack of fodder, limiting the mobility of cavalry and artillery. Disease spreads through the ranks, with dysentery and typhus taking a steady toll. Desertion increases as soldiers from satellite states see opportunities to escape from armies they were forced to join. The Grande Army that advances toward Moscow in August and September is already significantly weakened from the army that crossed into Russia just months earlier. The Battle of Borodino in early September 1812 represents the major engagement that Napoleon has been seeking, where Russian armies finally stand and fight to defend the approaches to Moscow. The battle is costly and inconclusive, with both sides suffering enormous casualties, and while Napoleon can claim tactical victory because the Russians retreat and leave him in possession of the battlefield, the strategic result is ambiguous. The Russian army is weakened but not destroyed, it retreats in reasonable order rather than collapsing, and Napoleon's own army is seriously damaged by the casualties suffered and by the cumulative effects of the long advance. Napoleon enters Moscow in mid-September, expecting that occupation of Russia's ancient capital will force Alexander to negotiate and to accept peace on French terms. But Alexander does not negotiate, and Moscow itself proves to be a trap rather than a prize. Much of the city burns, whether by accident or by deliberate Russian action remains historically debated, leaving the French army in occupation of a largely empty and partly destroyed city. Napoleon waits in Moscow for weeks, hoping that Alexander will agree to negotiations, sending messages that receive no response or receive responses that do not indicate willingness to make peace. Meanwhile, the Russian winter is approaching, and the Grande Army's position becomes increasingly precarious. In October, Napoleon finally accepts that remaining in Moscow is futile and orders the retreat. The withdrawal from Russia becomes one of history's great military disasters. The Grande Army retreats along the same route it used for the advance, through territory already devastated by the earlier passage of hundreds of thousands of men and animals. Supplies are exhausted, fodder is non-existent, and winter conditions worsen week by week. Russian forces harass the retreat, attacking stragglers and isolated units, though they generally avoid major engagements with the main body of Napoleon's army. Cossack cavalry, highly mobile and suited to the terrain and climate, prove particularly effective at disrupting French columns and cutting off detachments. As you rest quietly in the peaceful darkness, breathing slowly and deeply, you can sense the catastrophe unfolding as the Grande Army dissolves during the retreat from Moscow. Soldiers freeze to death, die from starvation and disease, are captured by Russians, or simply scatter into the countryside trying to save themselves. Units lose coherence as officers and men die or disappear. The artillery and baggage trains are abandoned as horses die and as retreating soldiers jettison equipment to move faster. By the time the remnants of the Grande Army struggle back across the Russian frontier in December, the army of over 600,000 has been reduced to perhaps 50,000 effective soldiers. The rest are dead, captured, missing, or scattered across Russia and Poland. The Russian campaign demonstrates the limits of French power and destroys the aura of invincibility that had surrounded Napoleon and the Grande Army for more than a decade. European powers that had submitted to French dominance because they saw no alternative now recognize that France can be defeated, that Napoleon's strategic judgment can fail, that the Grande Army is not an invincible instrument. This recognition will embolden Napoleon's enemies and will lead to formation of a new and more determined coalition that will eventually accomplish what previous coalitions failed to achieve: the defeat of Napoleonic France and the restoration of the European balance of power. The Russian disaster also has immediate military consequences for Napoleon. The hundreds of thousands of men lost in Russia, including not just soldiers but also horses and equipment, cannot be quickly replaced. Napoleon will raise new armies over the following months, but these will be armies of raw recruits rather than the experienced veterans who formed the old Grande Army. The military instrument that Napoleon wielded with such skill has been shattered, and while he can create new armies, he cannot recreate the force that dominated European battlefields for more than a decade. The balance of military power has shifted, not decisively but significantly, making future French victories more difficult and future French defeats more likely. In the wake of the Russian disaster, as you breathe slowly and rest comfortably, the European powers begin to organize a sixth coalition against France, bringing together Russia, Prussia, Austria, Sweden, Britain, Spain, and Portugal in the most comprehensive alliance yet formed against Napoleonic power. This coalition differs from previous ones in several important ways. It includes all the major European powers except France. It has learned from the failures of previous coalitions and has better coordination of strategy and more realistic assessment of what will be required to defeat France. And it faces a France that, while still formidable, has been seriously weakened by the loss of the Grande Army in Russia and by the continuing strain of the Spanish War. Prussia, which has been effectively neutralized since its catastrophic defeat in 1806, seizes the opportunity created by French weakness to re-enter the war in early 1813. Prussian military reformers have spent the years since 1806 reorganizing the Prussian army, studying French methods, and preparing for an opportunity to take revenge. The War of Liberation, as Prussians will call the campaign of 1813, mobilizes Prussian society in ways reminiscent of revolutionary France, appealing to German patriotic sentiment and to popular determination to throw off French domination. This represents a significant development in how European resistance to Napoleon is organized and motivated. Earlier coalitions relied primarily on traditional dynastic interests and on balance of power calculations. The Sixth Coalition also appeals to nationalism, to the desire of Germans and other peoples to free themselves from foreign domination. Napoleon, demonstrating the remarkable resilience that characterizes his career, raises new armies with speed that astonishes his enemies. By spring 1813, he has assembled forces of several 100,000 men, though these are armies of conscripts and raw recruits rather than the veterans who had served in earlier campaigns. He campaigns in Germany through the spring and summer of 1813, winning several battles and demonstrating that, despite the Russian disaster, he remains a formidable military commander. But these victories are not as decisive as his earlier triumphs, and they do not break the coalition's determination to continue the war. As you breathe slowly and let yourself relax more deeply, imagine the shifting dynamics of the campaign in Germany through 1813. The coalition powers have learned to avoid giving Napoleon the kind of decisive battle where his tactical brilliance and his ability to inspire his soldiers might overcome their numerical advantages. Instead, they employ what becomes known as the Trachenberg Plan, named after the location where coalition commanders devise it. The plan involves multiple coalition armies operating in coordination but avoiding battle with Napoleon himself while attacking French forces commanded by Napoleon's subordinates. When Napoleon moves toward one coalition army, it retreats, while other coalition armies press French forces elsewhere. This strategy frustrates Napoleon's attempts to achieve decisive victory while steadily grinding down French resources. Austria's decision to join the Sixth Coalition in August 1813 marks an important turning point. Austria has maintained neutrality through the first half of 1813, offering to mediate between France and the coalition but actually waiting to see how the military situation develops. Austrian Foreign Minister Clemens von Metternich conducts complex diplomacy, negotiating with both sides, seeking terms that would create a stable European order. But as French military prospects worsen and as coalition military power grows, Austria decides to join the coalition, adding its considerable military resources to the forces arrayed against France. The Battle of Leipzig in October 1813, sometimes called the Battle of Nations because of the number of nationalities involved on both sides, represents the decisive engagement of the German campaign. Coalition forces converge on Leipzig from multiple directions, surrounding Napoleon's army and forcing him to fight at a significant numerical disadvantage. After several days of fighting, Napoleon must order a retreat, withdrawing French forces westward toward the Rhine and abandoning Germany. The retreat from Leipzig becomes disastrous when a bridge is prematurely blown up, trapping thousands of French soldiers who are forced to surrender. The Grande Army that retreats from Germany is a shadow of its former self, having suffered enormous casualties and having lost most of its allied and satellite state contingents as German states defect from the French cause and join the coalition. The campaign of 1813 ends French dominance in Germany. The Confederation of the Rhine dissolves as German states abandon their alliance with France and either join the coalition or declare neutrality. French forces withdraw across the Rhine, abandoning territories that had been under French control or influence for more than a decade. Napoleon's empire contracts back toward France's traditional borders, though satellite kingdoms in Italy and French positions in Spain and Poland still remain for the moment. As you rest quietly in the peaceful darkness, breathing slowly and deeply, you can appreciate how the military balance has shifted fundamentally by the end of 1813. France has lost the initiative, lost much of its military power, lost most of its allies, and faces a coalition more determined and better coordinated than any that has challenged it before. The coalition powers, having seen French vulnerability in Russia and having achieved success in Germany, now consider possibilities that would have seemed fantastic just 2 years earlier, invading France itself, forcing Napoleon to abdicate, and reconstructing the European order in ways that would prevent renewal of French military dominance. The coalition offers Napoleon peace terms at the end of 1813, terms that would leave him as Emperor of France, but that would require France to accept its traditional frontiers and to abandon all claims to territories beyond those borders. These terms are relatively generous considering France's military position, and accepting them would preserve Napoleon's throne and would end the war. But Napoleon hesitates and then rejects the terms, gambling that he can recover militarily and can achieve better terms through continued fighting. This decision will prove momentous, as it ensures that the war will continue into 1814 and that subsequent coalition terms will be harsher. The winter of 1813 through 1814 sees both sides preparing for renewed campaigns. Napoleon works frantically to raise new forces, conscripting boys barely old enough to carry muskets, recalling veterans from Spain where French forces are being steadily pushed back by Wellington's British Spanish-Portuguese army, and scraping together whatever resources remain. The coalition powers plan their invasion of France, coordinating operations by multiple armies that will converge on Paris from different directions. The strategy reflects lessons learned over more than 2 decades of fighting France: coordinate operations, avoid giving Napoleon opportunities for decisive victories against isolated forces, and use superior numbers to overwhelm French resistance. As you breathe slowly and rest comfortably, let me tell you about the campaign of 1814, when coalition armies invade France and when Napoleon, despite brilliant defensive operations, cannot prevent the collapse of his empire. In January 1814, coalition forces crossed the Rhine into eastern France, bringing war into France itself for the first time in more than 2 decades. 3 major army groups advance into France: Prussian and Russian forces under the Prussian Field Marshal Blücher through northeastern France, an Austrian-led army through the Alsace region, and Austrian forces in northern Italy threatening southern France. Wellington's army is also advancing from Spain across the Pyrenees into southwestern France. Napoleon's strategic situation is desperate. He has raised armies that total perhaps 200,000 men, respectable in absolute terms but far smaller than the coalition forces invading from multiple directions that total over 1 million men. More importantly, Napoleon's armies are composed largely of raw recruits with little training and minimal experience, while coalition forces now include hardened veterans of the Russian and German campaigns. French resources are exhausted after more than 2 decades of continuous warfare. And perhaps most critically, French popular support for Napoleon and for continued war is wavering as French people experience invasion of their own territory and as the costs of Napoleon's ambitions finally come home. The campaign in France during the winter and spring of 1814 demonstrates Napoleon's abilities as a commander one final time. With inferior forces, he conducts a mobile defense, striking at isolated coalition forces, winning tactical victories through speed and concentration of force, attempting to slow the coalition advance and to divide coalition armies so they can be defeated in detail. For weeks, his campaigns in northeastern France achieve local successes and create hope among his supporters that he might yet reverse the strategic situation. But these tactical victories cannot overcome the fundamental disparity in resources, and coalition armies continue to advance on Paris despite temporary setbacks. As you breathe slowly and let yourself relax more deeply, imagine the exhaustion of France after more than 2 decades of revolutionary and Napoleonic warfare. The conscription has taken so many young men that French agriculture and manufacturing are suffering from labor shortages. The costs of maintaining armies and conducting campaigns have strained French finances despite the resources extracted from subject territories. The continental system, while intended to damage Britain economically, has also hurt French commerce and has created resentment among French merchants and consumers. The Spanish War continues to drain French military resources without offering hope of resolution. And now foreign armies are on French soil, occupying French towns and villages, requisitioning supplies, reminding French people daily of the costs of Napoleon's ambitions. Support for Napoleon among French political and military elites begins to crack as the military situation deteriorates. Some begin to consider whether France's interests might be better served by making peace and sacrificing Napoleon rather than continuing a war that France cannot win and that is destroying the country. Marshal Marmont, one of Napoleon's oldest supporters, enters into secret negotiations with coalition representatives. Other marshals and generals, while not actively betraying Napoleon, lose enthusiasm for continued fighting and begin to counsel acceptance of peace on whatever terms the coalition will offer. The coalition powers have made clear that they distinguish between France and Napoleon, that they are willing to make peace with France on reasonable terms, but that peace requires Napoleon's removal from power. This position reflects both propaganda purposes, allowing the coalition to claim that it fights not against the French people but against the tyrant who has oppressed them, and genuine calculation that lasting peace requires eliminating the source of French military aggression that has threatened European stability for more than 2 decades. The coalition supports restoration of the Bourbon monarchy, bringing Louis XVIII, brother of the executed Louis XVI, back to France as king. This restoration is presented as returning France to its legitimate government, though it also serves coalition interests by replacing an aggressive military empire with a regime that will be weaker and more dependent on coalition support. In late March 1814, coalition forces reach the outskirts of Paris. Napoleon is with his army to the east, attempting to threaten coalition lines of communication and to force the coalition to withdraw forces from the advance on Paris to protect their rear. But Paris's defenders, greatly outnumbered and lacking confidence that continued resistance serves any purpose, negotiate the city's surrender. Coalition forces enter Paris in triumph, and the provisional government that takes power immediately begins negotiating Napoleon's removal. Napoleon, informed that Paris has fallen and that his support has collapsed, initially wants to continue fighting, but his marshals refuse to continue the war. In early April 1814, Napoleon abdicates as Emperor of the French, accepting in exchange the sovereignty of the small Mediterranean island of Elba and the retention of his imperial title, though ruling now only over a tiny island rather than a European empire. The Treaty of Fontainebleau formalizes these arrangements, allowing Napoleon to depart for Elba with a small guard and a pension from the restored Bourbon government. As you rest quietly in the peaceful darkness, breathing slowly and deeply, you can appreciate the dramatic transformation that has occurred in just 2 years. In 1812, Napoleon ruled an empire that stretched from Spain to Poland, dominated all of continental Europe except Russia, and commanded military forces that seemed invincible. By April 1814, that empire has collapsed, Napoleon has abdicated, coalition armies occupy Paris, and the Bourbon monarchy has been restored. The transformation has been rapid but not unexpected given the accumulation of defeats and disasters beginning with the Russian campaign. The Treaty of Paris, signed in May 1814 between France and the coalition powers, establishes the peace settlement for France. The terms are surprisingly moderate considering France's position as defeated aggressor. France keeps its traditional borders as they existed in 1792, meaning that some Revolutionary-era conquests including parts of Belgium and territories in Western Germany are retained. France is not occupied by coalition armies and is not required to pay substantial reparations. The moderation of the terms reflects coalition recognition that France remains a major European power that must be integrated into the post-war order rather than humiliated and embittered, and also reflects desire to strengthen the restored Bourbon monarchy by allowing it to present itself as having achieved honorable peace terms. The coalition powers convene the Congress of Vienna to reconstruct the European political order and to create a stable system that will prevent future French aggression or any other power's attempt at continental dominance. Representatives of all European powers, major and minor, gather in Vienna in an extended conference that will last through much of 1814 and into 1815. The Congress addresses territorial issues, including disposition of territories that Napoleon had conquered and reorganized, questions of dynastic legitimacy and restoration, creation of a balance of power system that will discourage aggressive wars, and establishment of mechanisms for great power consultation and cooperation. The principle of legitimacy guides much of the Congress's work, as traditional monarchies that had been displaced by revolutionary and Napoleonic upheaval are restored to their thrones. But legitimacy is balanced with practical considerations about creating a stable balance of power. The Congress creates a strengthened Kingdom of the Netherlands, combining the former Dutch Republic with Belgium to create a stronger buffer against potential future French expansion. It reorganizes Germany, creating a German confederation to replace the defunct Holy Roman Empire, with Austria and Prussia as the dominant powers. It redistributes Italian territories, with Austria gaining significant influence in northern Italy. It confirms Russian gains in Poland and Finnish territories, Austrian influence in Central Europe, and British retention of various colonial and strategic naval bases acquired during the wars. As you breathe slowly and peacefully, you can sense that the Congress of Vienna is attempting to create a European order that will last, that will prevent renewal of the kind of devastating continental warfare that has characterized the previous 2 decades. But the Congress's work is not yet complete when, in March 1815, news arrives that Napoleon has escaped from Elba and has returned to France, that French troops have rallied to him, that Louis XVIII has fled, and that Napoleon has again proclaimed himself emperor. The 100 Days, as Napoleon's final episode in power will be called, has begun, and the coalition powers must mobilize one more time to finally and definitively end the Napoleonic threat. In March 1815, as you rest comfortably and breathe slowly, Europe is shocked by news that Napoleon has left Elba with a small force of loyal guardsmen and has landed on the French Mediterranean coast, beginning a dramatic march toward Paris that will see French troops sent to arrest him instead join his cause, culminating in his return to power without a shot being fired in opposition. This extraordinary episode demonstrates Napoleon's charisma and his hold on the imagination of the French people and army, but it also sets in motion events that will lead to his final and permanent defeat. Napoleon's return creates an impossible situation for him despite its dramatic success. The coalition powers, meeting in Vienna to reorganize Europe, immediately declare Napoleon an outlaw and an enemy of European peace, and they begin mobilizing forces to invade France and to remove him by force. There is no possibility of negotiation or accommodation. The coalition has defeated Napoleon once, has created a peace settlement, and will not allow him to disturb that settlement. Napoleon understands that his only hope is to defeat the coalition forces before they can fully mobilize and concentrate against France, to achieve military victories that might divide the coalition or convince some powers that accepting Napoleon's return is less costly than continuing the war. The Battle of Waterloo on June 18, 1815 is the final act of Napoleon's military career. French forces attack Wellington's British-Dutch army that has taken position on a ridge south of Brussels, attempting to break through Wellington's line and to scatter the British-Dutch forces before Prussian forces can arrive to support them. The battle is desperately fought, with French attacks coming close to breaking Wellington's line at several points. But Wellington's defensive position is strong, his troops are veteran units that have fought in Spain, and they hold despite French pressure. Meanwhile, Prussian forces, having recovered from earlier fighting and having marched rapidly to support Wellington, begin arriving on the battlefield in the afternoon, attacking the French right flank and threatening to envelop Napoleon's army. As you rest quietly in the peaceful darkness, breathing slowly and deeply, you can understand how the Battle of Waterloo represents the culmination of patterns that have developed throughout the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon demonstrates his tactical skill and his ability to inspire soldiers even in desperate circumstances. But he faces enemies who have learned how to work together, who coordinate their operations, who refuse to be defeated in detail, and who can bring superior numbers to bear. Wellington and Blücher, representing British and Prussian forces, exemplify the kind of coalition cooperation that has been difficult to achieve in earlier wars but that has become more effective through hard experience. The battle is costly for both sides, but the outcome is clear: Napoleon's army is defeated and forced to retreat in disorder. Napoleon's last gamble has failed. Napoleon returns to Paris to find that political support has evaporated. He abdicates again, this time without conditions, and surrenders to British forces, hoping that Britain might allow him some form of honorable retirement. But the coalition has learned its lesson from Elba. Napoleon is sent into exile on St. Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic, thousands of miles from Europe, where escape is impossible. He will live there for the remaining 6 years of his life, writing memoirs, refighting his campaigns in conversation, and watching from vast distance as Europe reorganizes itself in ways that reject his legacy. The final defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo and his permanent exile to St. Helena ends the Napoleonic Wars definitively. The coalition powers return to Vienna to complete their work of European reconstruction, implementing the settlement that Napoleon's return had interrupted. The map of Europe is redrawn, creating a system that will, despite periodic crises and conflicts, maintain relative stability for several decades and will prevent any single power from achieving the kind of continental dominance that France achieved under Napoleon. The human cost of the Napoleonic Wars has been enormous, though precise figures are impossible to determine. Military casualties from all the wars between 1792 and 1815 number in the millions, with deaths from battle, disease, privation, and the countless ways that war kills soldiers and civilians. Civilian populations have suffered from military operations, from occupation, from economic disruption, from conscription and requisition, from all the ways that total war affects societies. Entire regions have been devastated by the passage of armies, and some areas, particularly in Spain and Germany and Russia, will take decades to recover fully from the destruction. The political impact of the Napoleonic Wars extends far beyond the immediate territorial and dynastic changes implemented by the Congress of Vienna. The wars have demonstrated the power of nationalism as a motivating force, particularly in Germany and Spain, where resistance to French domination has appealed to popular patriotic sentiment in new ways. They have shown that mass mobilization of society for war can generate military power far exceeding what traditional limited armies could achieve. They have proven that military genius and tactical brilliance, while important, cannot overcome fundamental disparities in resources and coordination when enemies learn to work together effectively. And they have created a generation of Europeans who have experienced war's costs directly and who will, for the most part, be cautious about embarking on similar adventures in the future. Napoleon's legacy is complex and contested. His supporters emphasize his administrative reforms, his legal code that brought order and consistency to French law and influenced legal systems across Europe, his support for education and for rational organization of government, his role in spreading revolutionary principles including legal equality and merit-based advancement. His critics emphasize his autocratic rule, his wars that caused immense suffering, his betrayal of revolutionary ideals of liberty and popular sovereignty, his megalomaniacal ambition that sacrificed millions of lives in pursuit of personal glory. Both assessments contain truth, and Napoleon remains one of history's most controversial figures, simultaneously admired for his abilities and condemned for his ambitions. As we approach the conclusion of this story about Napoleon and the European coalitions that eventually defeated him, as you rest peacefully, breathing slowly and deeply, completely relaxed, let me reflect with you on what this long conflict reveals about power, about alliances, about how nations resist dominance, and about the patterns that emerge from more than 2 decades of warfare that reshaped Europe and that established principles that would influence international relations for generations. The Napoleonic Wars represent in many ways a struggle between 2 opposing principles of international order. On one side stood Napoleon's France, attempting to impose a hierarchical system with France as the dominant power and other European states as subordinates, satellites, or allies whose independence was constrained by French power and French interests. This system reflected Napoleon's personal ambitions but also represented a coherent vision of European organization, one that emphasized rationalization, standardization, and French leadership. On the other side stood the coalition powers, attempting to maintain or restore a balance of power system where no single state dominated, where states of varying size and power could coexist with recognized rights and spheres of influence, and where international order was maintained through negotiation and mutual restraint rather than through hegemonic control. The coalition powers' ultimate success in defeating Napoleon and in restoring a balance of power system demonstrates several important lessons about international politics and military strategy. First, it shows that sustained cooperation among multiple powers, even powers with different interests and different political systems, can overcome the advantages of unified command and centralized decision-making that a hegemonic power enjoys. The early coalitions failed partly because member states had divided objectives and poor coordination, allowing Napoleon to defeat them sequentially or to exploit their divisions through diplomacy. Later coalitions, particularly the Sixth Coalition, achieved better coordination through experience and through recognition that their fundamental interest in preventing French dominance outweighed their differences on other issues. Second, the wars demonstrate that military genius and tactical brilliance, while important, have limits. Napoleon was arguably the most talented military commander of his era, with an exceptional ability to plan and execute operations, to inspire soldiers, to make rapid decisions in fluid situations, and to exploit enemy mistakes. Yet these abilities could not overcome the fundamental resource disparities when coalition powers learned to avoid giving him the kind of decisive battles where his talents could be most effective and instead used their superior numbers and resources to grind down French power through attrition and through operations on multiple fronts simultaneously. As you breathe slowly and let yourself sink deeper into peaceful rest, you can appreciate how geography and resources ultimately mattered more than genius. France, even when augmented by satellite states and by resources extracted from conquered territories, could not indefinitely sustain warfare against all the major European powers combined. The coalition powers collectively had more population, more economic resources, more military potential, and more geographic space than France. Napoleon's early successes came partly from his abilities but also from the fact that he never faced all potential enemies simultaneously, that Britain could not project power onto the continent without allies, that Russia took time to mobilize, that Austria and Prussia did not coordinate effectively. As coalition powers learned to work together and as they all engaged simultaneously, French advantages were overwhelmed by coalition resources. Third, the wars illustrate the importance of popular mobilization and national sentiment in modern warfare. Revolutionary France's initial successes came partly from its ability to mobilize the entire nation for war through mass conscription and ideological motivation, creating armies much larger than those of its enemies. Napoleon benefited from this revolutionary legacy while also channeling French nationalism into support for his empire. But popular nationalism proved to be a double-edged sword. A Spanish resistance to French occupation and German resistance to French dominance demonstrated that other peoples could also mobilize popular sentiment for military and political purposes. The age of limited warfare waged by professional armies for limited objectives was giving way to an age of national warfare where entire populations participated and where conflicts took on ideological and existential dimensions that made them more intense and more difficult to terminate through negotiated compromise. Fourth, the conflicts reveal patterns about how empires overextend and eventually collapse under the weight of their own expansion. Napoleon's empire at its height in 1810 or 1811 appeared formidable, controlling or influencing most of continental Europe. But maintaining this empire required constant military presence to enforce French policies, to suppress resistance, and to prevent defection. The Spanish War and the continental system both demanded resources and created resentments that weakened the empire even as they were intended to strengthen French power. The Russian campaign represented strategic overreach, attempting to enforce French hegemony on a power that could not be easily controlled and that had the resources to resist indefinitely. Each expansion created new security challenges and required additional forces, creating a cycle where success bred vulnerability. Fifth, the wars demonstrated that economic warfare, while potentially powerful, has limitations and creates costs for the power imposing it as well as for its targets. Napoleon's continental system aimed to strangle British commerce and to force Britain to accept peace on French terms. But the system proved impossible to enforce completely, created economic hardship in territories required to comply, generated resentment and resistance, and hurt French interests as well as British ones. Britain's naval blockade of French ports was similarly intended to damage French power but had mixed results. Economic warfare remained subordinate to military outcomes rather than determining those outcomes independently. As you rest quietly in the peaceful darkness, breathing slowly and deeply, you can understand how the Napoleonic Wars shaped the 19th century European order that emerged from the Congress of Vienna. The Concert of Europe, the system of great power consultation and cooperation that the Congress established, aimed to prevent future hegemonic attempts and to resolve conflicts through negotiation rather than through war. This system was not purely successful, and Europe experienced numerous conflicts in the century after Waterloo, but it did prevent general European war on the scale of the Napoleonic Wars until 1914, a period of relative stability unprecedented in European history. The principle of balance of power became central to European diplomacy after 1815. Rather than allowing any single state to become dominant, the major powers worked to maintain rough equilibrium, forming alliances and counter-alliances to balance power, intervening to prevent any state from achieving hegemony. This system had the advantage of preventing the kind of continental domination that Napoleon achieved, but it also created a complex web of commitments and obligations that would eventually contribute to the outbreak of World War I when a crisis in the Balkans triggered alliance commitments that drew all major powers into conflict. The legacy of nationalism that the Napoleonic Wars helped unleash would prove enormously consequential throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. The wars had demonstrated that appeals to national sentiment could mobilize populations for political and military purposes. German nationalism, stimulated partly by resistance to French domination, would eventually lead to German unification in 1870 under Prussian leadership. Italian nationalism, similarly stimulated by French rule and by the example of French-imposed reforms, would lead to Italian unification in the same period. Nationalism would become the dominant political ideology of modern Europe, sometimes supporting liberal and democratic movements but also sometimes supporting aggressive and expansionist policies. The military lessons of the Napoleonic Wars influenced warfare for generations. Napoleon's emphasis on speed, concentration of force, and decisive battle became principles studied in military academies across Europe and beyond. His innovations in military organization, including the corps system that allowed large armies to move flexibly while maintaining ability to concentrate rapidly, became standard practice. His use of artillery and his integration of different arms, including infantry, cavalry, and artillery in coordinated operations, set patterns that would endure. Future military commanders would study Napoleon's campaigns as examples of operational excellence, though they would also study the limits that Napoleon encountered and the ways that coalition powers eventually defeated him. The administrative and legal reforms that Napoleon implemented in France and in conquered territories had lasting influence beyond his political and military legacy. The Napoleonic Code became the model for civil law systems across Europe and Latin America, providing clear and rational legal frameworks that replaced complex customary law. The administrative systems that Napoleon created, including prefects administering departments and rational tax collection, proved more efficient than the systems they replaced and were retained even after Napoleon's fall. The emphasis on merit-based advancement and on rational organization of government influenced reform movements across Europe, even in countries that opposed Napoleon militarily. Sleep peacefully now, dear friend, knowing that the story of Napoleon and the coalitions that resisted him is a story about human ambition and human limits, about how individuals can reshape history but cannot escape its constraints, about how power can be built through genius and determination but cannot be maintained without limits and without accommodation to others' interests. Napoleon achieved extraordinary success through his abilities and through circumstances that allowed those abilities to find expression. But he could not overcome the collective resistance of European powers determined to maintain their independence and to restore the balance of power that his success had overthrown. The Napoleonic Wars remind us that international order requires more than just power, that it requires legitimacy and acceptance, that attempting to impose order through force alone generates resistance that eventually overcomes even the most impressive military power. They remind us that alliances and coalitions, though difficult to maintain and coordinate, can achieve what individual powers cannot. They remind us that wars of unlimited ambition generate unlimited resistance and that the costs of hegemonic attempts ultimately fall on the power making the attempt as well as on its victims. Rest now in the knowledge that you have traveled through one of history's most dramatic periods, that you have witnessed how Europe struggled for more than 2 decades against a power that seemed at times invincible but that was eventually defeated through persistence, cooperation, and the mobilization of resources that no single power could match. Tomorrow you will wake refreshed, but tonight there is only peace, only rest, only the gentle embrace of sleep. The wars are long over. The coalitions have dissolved, Napoleon is centuries in his grave, and Europe has moved far beyond the conflicts that once consumed it. Sleep well, dear friend, in the quiet knowledge that even the mightiest empires eventually fall and that balance, though difficult to achieve, ultimately prevails over domination.